So what we are, all right, listen please. What we're going to be doing today is just talking a little bit about reptiles. And so now that we've gone through fish and amphibians, you probably noticed that we're talking about the same characters. How many chambers in their heart? How do they reproduce? What's their body covering in? So we're just continuing along in that. And so reptiles are something people often confuse. Sometimes reptiles and amphibians. Often they'll think like a salamander and think that that's a reptile, or that a lizard is an amphibian. But they're not. There are some important differences. And as we talk about the evolution of these different classes of vertebrates, we had fish live their whole lives in the water. Then some groups of fish evolved into amphibians. And what were amphibians able to do that fish could not?
Grow lungs.
Well, yeah, which allowed them to do what?
Breathe in the air.
Yeah, to live at least part of their life on land. But they still always required water for reproduction. They had to return to the water for reproduction. Well, then a group of amphibians evolved into reptiles. And reptiles took that one step further. And they were able to completely separate themselves from life in the water. And there's some adaptations, some characteristics that allow reptiles to live their entire lives out of the water and on dry land. And so some of those things are what we're going to talk about. And one important thing is their body covering. Because like you guys said in the question today, amphibians had thin, moist skin. And that's great. It allows them to breathe through it. But a difficulty is that it's easy to dry out if you have very thin skin. Because any moisture within your body evaporates through that thin skin. Reptiles have an adaptation that allows them to hold on to that moisture, and that's scales. Reptiles have bodies that are covered in scales, okay? And scales are waterproof. First off, they're dry. You know, sometimes people think if you pick up like a snake or something that it's going to be slimy, but it's not. Their scales are dry, and they're waterproof, and that helps hold in all the moisture so that they don't dry out. And it allows them to live in very, very dry conditions. There are some reptiles that live in the desert, and they can do that because they retain as much moisture as possible. Some reptiles can change the color of their scales, like a chameleon, to help it blend in or to help in terms of mating.
Did humans develop from reptiles?
Mammals did branch off from reptiles, so indirectly, yes.
So we're like reptiles?
No. In terms of reproduction, there's also some important differences. Because, as we just said, amphibians, they require water for reproduction. The female lays their eggs in the water, the male fertilizes them in the water, the young grow in the water. But reptiles developed a new means of reproduction. Okay? And that has to do with where the egg cells are fertilized. Because in reptiles, they have internal fertilization. So in fish and amphibians, the sperm cell combined with the egg cell to fertilize the eggs in the water, outside of the bodies. Well, reptiles develop internal fertilization. In internal fertilization, the male deposits sperm inside of the female reptile's body, where it fertilizes an egg. So that's internal fertilization. It's happening inside of the female's body. And that's important because then that can happen outside of the water. That can happen on dry land. Those eggs are not going to dry out because they're held inside of the female's body. Okay? So in the water, the sperm cells can reach the egg cell because they swim through the water. On dry land, that's not possible. So the male deposits sperm inside the female reproductive system. They fertilize the egg. And then for reptiles, after an egg gets fertilized inside the female, what do they do? This picture might give you a hint. Yeah, then after the egg cell is fertilized, it develops an egg around it, and then the females release that egg, and the young develop inside of it, outside of the body. Hello? No. That's okay. So these eggs that reptiles lay, they're not quite the same as what you might be familiar with an egg from the grocery store, chicken, a bird egg. The shell of a reptile egg is not hard and brittle like a bird egg is. It's sort of leathery, it's more flexible. It's still waterproof though, because most reptiles lay their eggs on land, and it's inside of that egg is a little watery environment for the embryo to grow inside of. It's like they took the water and moved it inside of an egg so that the embryo can develop inside of it.
Oh my god.
I just want the phone.
Hold on.
Can I answer it?
No.
I could.
Why are you laughing?
What time is it, Mr. Agent? Don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
Hey, Mary.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Brian, nurse's office. Jay, question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know how like
All right,
frogs?
guys, enough.
Well, how
Sam.
come? How come some animals, like like a giraffe and an elephant and us, we just have babies?
Yeah, so that's what we're, guys, Caleb in the back, listen please. So as we are going through these groups, we had fish, external fertilization, external development. Then amphibians, same thing, external fertilization, external development. Now in reptiles, we have internal fertilization, but still they lay the egg and then it develops outside. What do you think birds are going to be? Internal fertilization?
Internal.
External, because again, they lay an egg and the young develops in the egg. But then we get to mammals and things change. Once we get to mammals, what we're going to see is that they have internal fertilization, and mammals keep the embryo inside of them and it develops internally. So we're sort of moving along in the process here. Reptiles are also cold-blooded. Okay? Oh, and their eggs are laid on land. So reptiles are cold-blooded like fish, like amphibians. They cannot generate their own body heat. Their body temperature just depends on their surroundings. It can go up and down, depending on their environment. And there are advantages to being cold-blooded, and there's advantages to being warm-blooded. And there's also disadvantages to each. So let's talk about that for a minute. So fish, amphibians, reptiles are all cold-blooded. Their body temperature goes up and down. So what's a disadvantage of that? Why is that sometimes not very useful? Mia?
Because like when it's really cold, for example, then they can't do anything.
Yeah, in the cold temperatures, their body temperature drops down and they basically cannot be active. So right now, you go, when it's cold out, you go around, you don't see any fish, any amphibians, any reptiles that are very active in the wintertime in areas where it's cold. But if you go home after school, will you see squirrels running around? Yeah, will you see rabbits and other mammals? Yeah. So being cold-blooded means when it gets cold, you can't do much. Do you know what an advantage of being cold-blooded is, though? If you've ever had a pet reptile?
You can go to different places.
Not necessarily, because if you go to extreme cold, you can't survive there, where mammals can. So something else.
Well, I'm confused.
Wait, advantage
Mammals
for-
can survive,
In very cold conditions, yeah. So there's like polar bears and
but what mammals?
and penguins and so forth in the Arctic under cold conditions, because they're not relying on the environment for their body temperature. They're keeping it constant by generating body heat. The downside, the benefit though of being cold-blooded then, if you don't have to make your own body heat, what does that mean about how much you need to eat?
Energy.
You don't need to eat very much. Has anyone had pet snakes?
No.
How often do you have to feed them?
Like a lot though,
Oh, it was a
Once
while ago?
Yeah.
Once a week.
Sometimes, depends on the one, what you're feeding it, once a week. Some people, depending on it's once a month.
They only eat.
But if you have something like a pet hamster, you have to have food constantly. If you have a pet bird, it always needs to have food. Because warm-blooded animals use up a lot of their energy just keeping their body temperature high. So cold-blooded is not great sometimes because you can't be active at cold conditions, but it is good because you don't need that much food to stay alive. Warm-blooded animals, the benefit is you can be active even if it's very cold out. Okay, you can still be active. You can live in very cold conditions. The downside is you need a lot of food, a lot of energy to maintain that high body temperature. So reptiles are cold-blooded though. So, you know, if you ever had a pet snake or something in the cage with it, you have a heat lamp or you have a heated fake rock that you plug in because you need to keep them in their environment at a high temperature so they can be active. So reptiles are cold-blooded. Anthony?
And they go like monster type meat.
Sometimes. It depends on the reptile, and it also depends on how big the meals they eat. Like reptiles that eat very large prey, they can eat their prey and then live off of it for like a month at a time and not eat again.
Are like anacondas.
Yeah, they would generally eat large prey, and then they basically, like large predator snakes, they'll eat a meal, and if it's a big meal, they'll digest it and just sort of stay and work and digest it, and then their digestive organs shrink up for a long time until they need to eat again, because that food can sustain them for a long, long time. And I'm going to show you a video in a minute about snakes eating. Jake?
So my snake was very little, and like maybe like this big.
Okay.
I did.
Come here.
And then we gave it a rat,
Uh-huh.
maybe like twice the size of it.
Yep.
Well, not like really twice the size of it. It was a really fat rat,
Yep.
and it just like spread its mouth so wide.
Yeah, well, that's what we're going to talk about on the next slide, so I'm going to come back to this in 1 minute. Let's just finish up. Circulation. So,
What the heck? I must have showed him a picture of Mr. Duras.
okay, yeah. Right, at the end of class. At the end of class. All right, so when we talked about fish, Rosie, turn around, please. Caleb, can you get that door, please?
I can get it.
So, fish. How many chambers in the heart?
3.
2. Amphibians? 3. Reptiles is a little more than 3, and I'll explain this in a second. What we say is that reptiles have a 3 1/2 chambered heart. Now that may sound weird, because how do you have a half a chamber? This is a diagram showing sort of what a reptile heart looks like. It's very similar to the amphibians. You have a chambers on top, the atrium on top, then you have the ventricle here, but what is present in reptiles is a wall that partially separates this ventricle. So it's almost like it's 2 separate chambers. It's not quite complete, but it's close. And so they have what we call 3 1/2 chambered heart. And again, the point of this is that it allows oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood to keep pretty much separate, which is more efficient at getting oxygen to the cells. Caleb?
Is there any such thing as a one chamber heart?
No. Well, I guess in some things like a worm, sort of, but not in invertebrates. All right, so Jake just mentioned his snake, and we know, and you probably have heard, snakes can eat prey, so even though a snake is sort of narrow, they can swallow and consume prey that's much larger than their actual
Their
bodies.
stomach stretches.
So several things. So first off, the jaw of a snake, it's not like two bones that just open and close like this. Their bottom jaw has actually 2 bones that can kind of separate. And so a snake has a very flexible jaw, can open this way, and it can open wide this way as well. Because often snakes will ingest prey that's bigger than their body would normally ingest. And also, their intestine and stomach can expand. Okay, their whole body can expand. You're going to see in this snake is going to eat an egg, and it eats this entire egg, even though it's like 4 times as big as a snake, and its body expands.
Wait, they eat the shell too?
So hold on, I'll tell you in a second. The other thing is, so if you were going to eat something bigger than your body, you put it in your mouth, you're not going to be able to breathe. But snakes have an adaptation. Their trachea that they use for taking in air is actually way at the front of their mouth. It's up here. And so when it eats this giant egg, its trachea is sort of at the bottom, sticking out a little bit, so it can continue to get air even though its mouth is full of this very large egg. So it's another adaptation they have to being able to eat foods that are much bigger than themselves. So let me show you the video, and then I'll answer all these questions, but I want you to see a video before we talk much more about it. So this snake is going to eat an egg.
Is it a time lapse?
No, this is pretty much real time.
Does the body like get bigger?
Just watch, you're going to see. Now, snakes don't have teeth for chewing, so basically they swallow their prey whole.
How do they get that number?
Watch. And so you see they sort of work their jaw around this big egg and slowly just sort of inch it forward.
Oh boy, that's disgusting.
Is it
Come here. So again, there's a point when you could see the trachea, and I'll pause it. Because the trachea is on the bottom, it's out here, so it's still getting some air into it, even though its mouth is full of this huge egg.
Why is it pink?
It's because the skin is stretching, so it's almost like you could see through it. Like you could see the specks on the egg through those scales that are on the outside.
Whoa. Happy. When does he dissolve?
Just watch.
Uh-oh. Is it hatching?
All right, here, this is the trachea, this little tube that's way near the front of the mouth. That goes back into the snake, into its lungs. So again, if all of its mouth is full, this part could still be exposed to still take in some air. So you see the snake sort of wriggled around. What do you think it's doing when it's doing that?
Try to get it in there.
Well, it's in there, something else. Trey?
Digesting?
Well, before it can digest, it has to do something. Somebody asked her.
Chewing. Get rid of the
It's
shell.
almost like chewing, because what's it have to do to that egg?
Breaks it down.
Break it. It needs to break it open so that the inside parts that it can actually digest are available. And so once it's done that, which it already has now, you'll see.
You could smash yourself against a rock.
Oh, what is that? Shell. Where'd it go?
It's just the shell. So it cracks the egg, breaks the egg,
Boy.
so it can start to digest the insides of the egg, and then regurgitates the shell, so because it's not digestible material. So that when it was slithering back and forth, what it was doing is pressing the egg against its vertebrae to break it open, so it can actually absorb those
What
nutrients.
if it eats like a rocket?
Boy,
a
let's
rat
make that egg video.
They're usually pretty strong
What
digestive
if
systems.
like it eats a rabbit and like what's it do with the bone?
The bones go through, smaller parts could go through, and it depends on the type of